All right, Jimmy?
Great.
All right, great. Okay, I think we should start kind of at the beginning. I think we should start with Brookside. You started actually quite, relatively late. It's not like you came to Brookside as a 20-year-old. You came to Brookside in your 30s. Do you think that that was a help or a hindrance when it comes to writing? Did you have ideas already that you wanted to get out in there?
No. I'd done a bit of theatre, but I couldn't write theatre to save my life. I didn't know that at the time.
You're saying you didn't like it?
Pardon?
Did you not like theatre?
I don't like theatre, no. But 9 times out of 10, it's boring, and they say to you, "Oh, you should have been here last week. It was great." And that always happens to me. So, but I was immature, I hadn't gone to university or anything like that, and I think I was so lucky to be in the right place at the right time, because Brookside was done by Mersey TV on Merseyside. They needed Merseyside writers. And my stint in the theatre had at least given me a body of work.
Yeah.
It was not good, but it demonstrated stamina. That was it. And so I think it was that really. I had, but for 12 months I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody knew what they were doing on that show. It was the birth of Channel 4. We were all. I think the average age on Brookside for everybody working behind the scenes was 30, which is incredibly young. The thing that I would do then is I would follow the storyline slavishly, because people who know things have given me this storyline, and I know nothing, so I've got to follow the storyline. And without a word of a lie, it took me about 9 months to realise you've got to give of yourself to that storyline. And I just didn't know that. It took me a while to find that out even.
Yeah, but that's just learning on the job. That's the best way to learn, isn't it, really? Yeah. And given, we're not meant to call them soaps, are we, anymore?
No.
But I'm going to call it a soap.
So, yeah.
There's something about generating storylines, having to do it quite quickly. Once you break away from that idea that you've just got to stick to whatever storyline you're given,
yes,
it must be quite exhilarating. You must learn a lot by doing that.
Quite early on, I knew I was worth my place. Even though my scripts were not good, I could generate story. Monday and Tuesday were the storyline meetings, and we'd have about 12 writers around the table, and all desperately trying to come up with ideas, because if you came up with an idea, you might get commissioned because it was your idea. You got more of a chance of getting commissioned, and that meant money and your name on the telly. And so it was all very, very earnest and serious. But I knew I could generate story. And also, Brookside had an agenda then. It was political, And so we'd all be fighting to get our angle on, and the tricks I pulled, I would use, the obvious one is, listen, I come from here. I'm a working class lad, all that stuff. And it was all to earn brownie points, and I became pretty good at generating story to such an extent that I could generate story from the smallest incident. I could, because often you had to. I had an episode of Brookside to write, and the storyline was Tracy wins a hairdressing competition, and that was the story. It was just ridiculous. So. I could generate. You had to explore the minutiae. You had to dig as deep as you possibly could. And I think I can still do that, to excavate. Because you're excavating the story and you're excavating within yourself to bring yourself to it. How can I make this me? It's. Everything I learned there.
There's a lot. You worked really hard on Brookside, and you got a lot of work done.
Yeah.
Have you ever, in your later years, kind of consciously recycled the Brookside storyline? Be honest. Probably.
Yes and no. In 1989, when I packed in Brookside, I realised that. The television writer especially, but all writers, they dream of reaching a point where they can write what they most want to write, where they will write only what they want to write. But when you reach that point, you realise that to get there, you've already written it. And all the stuff in Brookside was everything that mattered to me. At the time, I was a trade unionist and social. I'm not now. I'm a kind of half-arse socialist and half-arse trade unionist. but I was well into Catholicism, you know. So all those things were in Brookside, and so I just threw myself into it, you know. But those themes have repeated themselves constantly. But I think we all write about the same thing. We just disguise it well.
You tend to write about the working class. You don't write. You have done, and you do write about the middle class, but it's mostly working class.
Yes.
And do you want to explain why you choose that?
Yeah. I just think if you don't, you're missing a trick. That, you know, in a soap opera especially, you can decide the most extraordinary things that in real life would have enormous financial consequences. But in the soap opera, they never discuss the financial consequences. It's always the emotional, isn't it? You know. But in real life, you just wouldn't do that. You know, often in a drama, somebody will take off a ring and throw it away. Or, what? You know, you'd never see that. You'd sell it. You wouldn't. You just wouldn't. You know, it's just things like that. So that's just an added dimension. The enormous financial burden becomes an added dimension.
I want to move on to, we've grouped kind of 3 dramas together, and one of them was a very particular drama that you wanted to mention called Needle. Do you want to tell people about this? Because not so many people know this film, I don't think.
Yeah. I packed in Brookside, and it was about 1989. I imagined the phone would ring. I imagined I'd get phone calls from people, you know, do you want to write this? Nobody rang me at all, you know. I was just a soap opera writer. And then I got one phone call from George Faber. The older people will know George Faber to be like a wonderful executive producer at the BBC. He did Screenplay. He wanted a writer to write about the needle exchange scheme, which was strong on Merseyside. This was my big break. The phone had rung, and honest to God, I did loads of research on it and just threw myself into it. If I make a mess of this, you know, it's Emmerdale Farm. You know, it's, you know, so I couldn't go back to Brookside. So, but I remember every decision I made. Every decision I made. You want to impress people. This is going to get done, and for years later it'll be my calling card. I've got to impress. You know, I've got to show them that I'm better than the average writer. I'll do things that the average writer will not do.
And where did Needle lead you with your storytelling? Because one of the things that happens in Needle is essentially, one of the things I very much enjoyed about that film is that it's not morally ambiguous, but it shows all the sides, doesn't it? It shows the sides of people who are upset about the drug users and the people who are trying to stick to a very moral approach, which is to let them have needles, and then the pressure on the politician makes her change her mind. One of the things that I found very interesting about that is that you are known as a moral writer, generally, but it's quite ambiguous in Needle, isn't it?
Yes, it's probably more ambiguous because it's better than a lot of the stuff I've written. You know, you just got to give the devil the best tunes, haven't you? You know, and so you give the opposing arguments, the ones about which you're suspicious, much more strength and depth, you know. But I could see both sides.
You've basically indicated that you do a lot of research for your work. There's normally a deadline.
Yeah.
How does that work? How much research? How hard do you push that deadline?
I know, that's the thing, isn't it? I'm sure we've all been there. The research is so enjoyable, isn't it? You know, but you've got to start. You've just got to do it, haven't you? I hate writing page 1. You know, it's just when I was writing Cracker, we'd do each story was a 3-parter. It would be roughly 150 pages long. So you'd finish one, you know, a 3-parter, and you'd be knackered, you know, because you'd put a lot into Cracker. A lot of me was in Cracker. A lot of stuff I knew was in Cracker, you know. So you'd put a lot into it, and you'd finish it, and then you'd write story number 2, page 1, you know, and you're another 150 pages to go. You know, it was just so destroying, you know, really. And it's not like writing a novel, you know. They want it, you know. You've got to do it, you know.
But that's maybe the best way, otherwise you never would.
Yeah, probably.
Shall we talk a little bit about Hillsborough? As obviously an incredibly important film and a really difficult film because it's a real story. It's not fictionalized. When you you've talked about it before, obviously, and one of the things that you've said is the story in those situations belongs to the victims, it belongs to the families.
Yes.
But obviously from Hillsborough there's lots of different sides, isn't it? How do you ensure that that you're representing it in the right way? Because even within the families there were arguments, weren't there? Everyone was very different in their approach.
With a thing like Hillsborough, it was easier in that the press had been appalling. You know, the Sun front page, the truth. The fans pissed on the dead. That's what the Sun said. They pissed on the dead. They robbed from the dead, and they battered coppers who were bravely trying to resuscitate the dying. That's what the Sun front page said, and other outlets picked that story up as well. You know, so part of the drive was to correct that imbalance. You know, it happened in 1989, and I came to it in 1996. And for the intervening years...
Can I just ask, how did you come to it? Were you asked to do it?
I wrote an episode of Cracker about a lad called Albie who simply went around killing journalists on the Sun. But he also had this... he was a socialist. He was a socialist, and but he worked in a factory. He was a working class man who worked in a factory, but he was an intelligent socialist as well. So he was a contradiction. And but at a certain point in the film, he decides to act the way people expect him to act. So he shaves his head, and the first victim is a Pakistani news agent, because that's what's expected of him, you know. And then he went after coppers and journalists on the Sun and things like that. Yeah. And it was everything I felt, you know. I know I'm going to offend a lot of people here, but from the time I was working on Brookside, I was on Easy Street, and all I saw was my brothers and sisters and families and friends devastated. You know, factory closure after factory closure after factory closure, and there was this massive attack upon the British working class, but it was especially violent against the white working class male. The intellectual left saw them as fascists and bigots, and the intellectual right just attacked them anyway, you know. And I saw this happening, you know. Derek Hatton, part of the militant tendency. Oh, how the intellectual left despised that man. You know, bolshy, outspoken Scouser with a shiny face. You know, football fans. Oh, how the intellectual left despised them. Fascists and bigots and racists and homophobes, all of them. This was trade unionists. Oh, for God's sake, wake up, get up to the times. You're fighting a lost cause. Those days are gone. Get over it. You know, all those working class institutions being smashed, our culture being robbed from us. You know, I saw all that going on. Orgreave, the miners' strike. That, you know, the coppers with bulging pay packets. 65% pay rise from Mrs. Thatcher. First thing she did, gave our police officers a 65% pay rise. And Orgreave and things like that was the direct result. You know, where they smashed the trade union movement. The strongest union in our country was smashed by overpaid coppers, overzealous coppers. You know, and so I saw all this, and I was not surprised that 89 came and Hillsborough happened. You know, get in there, you Scouse bastard, get in there. You know, you'd be met at railway stations and battered. They'd hit you over the head. Get against that wall, you know, you Scouse bastard. And this went on and on and on. And so I wasn't at all surprised it happened in 89, and I just exploded, you know. And I just made a vow that in future, I would see my allies on the left, but working class people would be my natural allies. Yeah. You know, I just stopped trusting the intellectual left. And anyway, I think Cracker. I wrote the Hillsborough drama, but that episode of Cracker came out of all that. Yeah. You know, a white working class male, sick of everything.
Yeah, being called scum for so long.
Yes. Yeah. So. And he was a Scouser, you know. So.
And so that led you to Hillsborough, which was
well, then the Hillsborough families found out what was going on, and they came, and we met them all, and we had a big screening for them. And they took... Again, the left were finding reasons to object. Why are you doing this? They thought I was doing it for the money, you know. I mean, it's just, you know, that was the last thing. I had to give them the bloody money away, you know. But the families themselves, those who'd been there, you know, they were well into it. Yes, you know, especially when you killed a Sun journalist. Yes, you know, it was just amazing. But then there was a bond formed.
Yeah.
And then I went out for a walk. And it was a beautiful summer's day. And I came back, and on my doorstep was Doreen Jones and Jenny Hicks. Doreen had lost her boy there, and Jenny had lost 2 daughters at Hillsborough. And I'll never forget the simplicity. You know, I walked up to them, and they said, "Jimmy, we've come to ask you to tell our story." That was it. Yeah.
One of the key things about Hillsborough is actually something that comes up a lot in your work, which is the difference between law and justice.
Yes.
That's what the whole film, in the end, the second half of the film is about, really, isn't it? And actually, it's a theme that runs right the way through your work, isn't it? That the law doesn't work in the way that you think it's going to.
I know. Until you're caught up in something, you know, not many people in this country realise that law and justice are totally different things. And law can be incompatible with justice. And law is designed to keep you away from justice. You know, and you don't find that out until you're embroiled in it.
Common, which is a film, a TV drama that came out last year, which also concerns the law. When you wrote Common, you're obviously addressing this issue in particular, but the law is not only, you know, not only always without justice, it's also quite complicated, isn't it?
Yes.
So there are elements within when you're writing that you have to simplify, don't you? It isn't exactly as it would be. Is that true?
No, and no, all the time. But better, it's far better for lawyers to say, "Oh, you got that wrong, McGovern," than for a viewer to say, "I don't understand any of this." You know, you have to keep it simple. Yeah. Or you just have to keep the drama moving and the story moving. And
when you talk, it's really obvious. The stuff that makes you passionate, the stuff that you want to write about, it's injustice. It's completely, you know, clear.
Yeah.
There is a lot of injustice in the world. Do you not ever get completely battered down by it? By the fact that these things happen, that you feel compelled to write about them. It's quite a dark path sometimes.
Common came about because I opened up a letter from a woman who had a loved one inside, and there was a murder, and this boy was nowhere on the scene, but he had to confess to GBH or face trial for life for murder. So he confessed to GBH and got 10 years, you know, rather than do life. I opened up this letter, and exactly as you said, I said, "No, I've had enough. I've had enough of this. I'm not going to get involved in this, you know." So I was just about to write back and say, "Thank you very much, but I'm too busy, stroke, old, stroke, tired, stroke, you know, to you know." And then I looked at the date on the letter, and it was a month old. The letter was a month old. So I turned the envelope over, and she used the wrong postcode. So I said to myself, I can't let this woman think I sat on this letter for a month whilst her boy's inside for you know. And so I phoned up intending to say, "I haven't sat on this letter. You posted to the wrong address, but as soon as you get the human voice on the end of the line, that's it. You're hooked." You know. So that's the reason I was into Common. I didn't mean to do it. You know.
I'm slightly conscious of time, so I want to kind of move on from those 3 kind of very particular dramas to The Street and Accused.
What we got on The Street particularly was we trawled for writers and we trawled for stories. We didn't entertain the notion of the writer. You know, our point was there are so many writers, but there are very few stories. You know, so we trawled for stories, and we got them in, and we picked the ones that I could write if the writer failed. Right. You know, so it was a great luxury, and often the writer did fail. You know, and I would rewrite every single word. But particularly in the first series, I think in all of them on The Street, the writer got sole credit, even if he was even if every word was changed. You know, but that notion of sitting back and thinking, yeah, I could write that, but then commissioning a writer. There was a writer that we hired a writer who was a drug dealer, and he hadn't written a word. He'd never written a word in his life, but he had this story. And I thought, well, if you write about drugs, or this person who doesn't know anything about drugs writes about drugs, yours will be more immediate. And so we commissioned him.
And how do you find, because you do that a lot, you work with other writers,
Yes.
don't you? And obviously that's going to involve some form of hand-holding or, you know, rewriting the whole thing.
Yes.
How do you find that? Do you enjoy it, or do you find it frustrating, or, you know?
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. It's the fact that you haven't got to write page 1 yourself. You know,
You just go, that's rubbish, start again.
Well, exactly. You aren't writing. Once you've got a 60-page script in, you are no longer writing. You are rewriting, and there's a massive difference there. You'll know when it's good, but you'll know it's personal. You'll know the writer is writing it from somewhere in here. You know, alcoholism. You know, we had a story like that on the street. That was deeply personal to that writer. You know, and the energy level will be sky high. Yeah. You know, there won't be any bullshit. There won't be any tired regurgitation of cliches, because often the writers were brand new. Yeah. They couldn't identify what was a cliche and what wasn't. You know, so all that was going on as well, and it was a dream. It was a beautiful process. Yeah. You know, and apart from one writer who we sacked because he was an arrogant bastard, apart from that, I think every writer who did The Street and Accused would say it was a good process, you know. And we treated them fairly you know, we give them title and we paid them full whack, you know. Don't get me wrong, we failed often, you know. But at its best, we had simplicity of narrative and complexity of character. And I think that's a wonderful mantra for a TV drama. You know, what you do not want is simplicity of character and complexity of narrative. That's ridiculous, you know.
You get that quite a lot.
So we that's what we had, because characters are complex, you know. There was that. And the other one was, at the end of it all, at the end of the story reigned supreme. Leave your ego at the door. And they got battered. The writers got battered. I had them in tears sometimes, you know. They really got a hard time, because all that mattered was the story, nothing else. Not your ego, not your training, not your ambitions. This story is all I care about, you know. But when we got it really, truly right, we'd end up with something approaching a final draft that was bloody good, you know. And then we wouldn't leave it at that. We'd have another go. And any trace of the writer was taken out. Any sign of effort, you expend more effort to disguise that effort. You know, it's as if, at its very best, it was as if we found a story in the street. You know, the seeming absence of the writer, the simplicity of the storytelling. You know, surely we found this story in the street. You know, and hours and hours of work to even get to the seeming absence of the writer. And the lack of effort takes even more effort than you've ever envisaged. You know, it really does. It's funny, isn't it? Because I always, you know, in the 80s, I'd sit and watch TV, you'd see Alan Bleasdale, and you'd have all these wonderful actors, and, you know, you go, you don't know how lucky you are. Look at Brookside, the pieces of wood I'm working with, you bastard. You know, and then suddenly... But then you realise that, you know, the script gets the director it deserves, the director gets the writers the script, and he deserves, you know, and so, or she deserves, you know, and so on, you know.
How, in your illustrious career, how do you think you've changed as a writer, or haven't you?
Oh, that's a good one now. I've got this analogy. You start off life and you've got this creative angel on your right shoulder, you know, and this emaciated critical devil, you know. And you're thick, you don't know anything, but you've got energy and enthusiasm, and you're right, you know, and your creative angel telling you it's marvellous, and the critical devil can't get a word in. But as you get more and more experience, the critical devil and the creative angel sort of equal each other. And I think that's pretty good then. You know, you're doing good work then. But as you get a little bit more, as you age a little bit more, the bloody critical devil is bigger now, you know. Hence the paralysis of page 1, you know. I can't, you know, I know how to start this drama, but it's shit. This critical devil is telling me it's shit. So I can't get started. I know more than I've ever known about writing. And I think when I do it, it's better. I think some of the stuff I did on the street, and Banished even, some of the stuff I did on Banished was better than a lot of the stuff I'd written prior to that.
Yeah.
But, my God, it's harder. You know, I find it much harder.
Yeah.
It doesn't come easy. And that's another thing I tell myself. When I was churning it out, you know, and people picking up BAFTAs on my work, you know, if it's true, if I'd known then how hard it was, I'd have charged them a hell of a lot more. You know, it was, you know, I only know now how hard it is, you know.
And you just quickly mentioned Banished, which I have to say I got completely addicted to and watched them all in one go. That one seemed, I mean, to write was that, you've just said it was very difficult. To watch, it was much more of a kind of romp to watch.
Yes.
Was it?
Yeah, but I wrote that in a totally different way. I wrote nearly 4 episodes before we got the green light, because I was writing this as a 19th century novel, you know, and I really enjoyed the writing of it. I really did, and there was some good stuff in there, but I think we went wrong. Well, we went wrong because we got BBC Two, which is, you know, oh, how dare we have that Scouser on our channel? You know, get him off. You know, this isn't Wolf Hall. You know, that was the attitude. But really early on, this convict woman says to this guard, "Do you want a shag or a wank?" That was really early on, and there was a critic. There was a critic who said, "I know exactly where that came from. A grubby drama, because this convict woman from the East End of London uses words like shag and wank. You know, so this grubby drama. So there was a lot of that going on, but it was undeniably flawed as well. I'm not going to hide from that. It was undeniably flawed, but some of it was really well written. Yeah."
Thank you so much, firstly, for the talk. It's wonderful. But I was wondering, the story room you described for Accused in the Street sounds very similar to the American writer's room style. And I don't know anything about, I hope to, but I don't yet know anything about writing in England. But it seems that people tend to write alone. And I was wondering, given the dearth of script editors, as you were saying, is there a place for creating that kind of culture of writers' rooms here, and what would be needed if you think it is a positive thing?
I know. I'm so glad you asked that question, because it comes up every so often. You know, the BBC, they are so far behind the times, but every now and again they talk about the writers' room. We shall have to emulate the American writers' room. The cost of the American writers' room is prohibitive. You know, those guys get paid an absolute bloody fortune. I subsidised the BBC. On the street and Accused, I was taking scripts that just were not working. The scripts were not working. And because of the commitments we'd entered into with that writer, I would rewrite the entire script and get paid nothing. Get paid absolutely nothing. You know, I was subsidising the BBC because I cared so much about the programme. You know, but I would love it. I would love it. We could produce something really special if they would fund a writer's room properly. You know, and have a group of 4 writers, 4 or 5. We don't want too many. 4 or 5 writers, a guy or a woman in charge, and map out every story beat. Every story beat, week after week after week, every single story beat, and only then send the writer away to write it. You know. You've got 4 or 5, 6 experienced people, wonderfully experienced in storytelling, mapping out every single story beat, and then you're sending an experienced writer away to do even better, to bring something else to it, to bring a passion and a vitality to the writing. It couldn't fail, but the BBC will never fund it. They will never fund it. They haven't got a clue about that kind of thing. They rely on people like me to subsidise them. You know, I was knackered. So it wasn't really a writer's room. It was, I don't know what I was. I was like a backstop, an unpaid backstop.
We haven't heard you say very much about Cracker, which always seemed to me to be a really transformational piece of television. And I think I watched all of it, but I always knew when I was watching an episode that you didn't write. Paul Abbott, for example, has gone on to great things. Didn't write Cracker as well as you did. Is it really true that when you met Robbie Coltrane, you said, "I'd imagined him being thin"?
Oh, shocking, yeah. It was, God, I know there are loads of writers in this room, so you'll identify with this. Gub Neal the kind of producer you dream about. He saw something in me that nobody else had seen. And he wanted me to write this drama series called Cracker, about a psychologist. I had certain actors in mind. I was a huge fan of John Cassavetes, both as a writer and a filmmaker and an actor. You know, I really loved him. And he had that kind of energy I admire, you know, never ever stopping, you know. And Gubb says to me, what kind of character do what do you see him as? And I said, you know, a thin, wiry guy, loads of energy, you know. He says, Coltrane, you know. But I trusted Gubb because he'd seen something in me. So I thought he must be coming from somewhere, you know. So we're travelling up to Scotland, to Glasgow. We go to Robbie, of course. Robbie doesn't come to us. We've got to go up to Scotland to see Robbie at his house on the shores of Loch Lomond or somewhere, you know. So it's about 10:30 in the morning, and I'm like that. Oh, God, you know, I don't fancy this at all, trying to encourage this man, you know, to take this part. Why are we doing this? Why do we need him? Why can't we just cast an actor who's right? Why have we got to get a big star and all that? You know, the usual things that a writer does. But basically, I find it difficult to talk to actors, it's particularly big-named actors, you know. And so, fatal flaw, like, I had a drink, I had a whiskey. And then that settled me down a bit, so I had another one. Anyway, got off the train and I was legless. And this is about 11:30 in the morning, but by the time we got up there. And we go to meet Robbie, and I just, you know, I just blurted everything out. I saw him as a thin man, Robbie. I saw him as a tiny wee thin man, and you're a big fat bastard. You know, and he's looking, but he'd seen this. I think he'd seen the first script, and he'd seen what was going on, and I think he wanted it. You know, I think he wanted it, so he tolerated me. I think, you know. But it was nervousness, really. I think that's why so many writers are fond of a drink. You know, we're solitary people, and yet we have to go out and meet people, and we don't like it, you know, and we just calm down, you know, yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much, Jimmy.
That's the real beauty of film as collaboration, where these very fine actors have observed from their perspective what is wrong with your script and have given suggestions as to how to improve it.
And that's always the way with our writing, I think. We are never satisfied with the first root idea of a gentle, you know, we tried to do it, we can never do it. It always feels lacking if there isn't somebody being murdered or some kind of dreadful extra element.